If we were to somehow catch a glimpse of what life could be, of just how much fundamentally happier, healthier, and well-oriented we're all collectively capable of being, I've long been convinced that not a single person would rest until we'd bridged this gap between the is and the could be. We live in a world gone mad. We've been led down a primrose path incrementally, while the values we formerly held to be most sacred are everywhere inverted. A culture of selfish and deceitful men have essentially purchased a large subset of weak and hollow men to hasten the imposition of their culture and ideology upon us, along with their framework and perspective, compelling us to play their game and forget our own, to masterful effect. For several decades now, this type has come to essentially control the world as we know it. In fact, I've often felt that if I were forced to envision and develop an economy, culture, and system of governance and management that would serve to retard human development and waste physical, mental, and spiritual energy, cause the species to spin their wheels, achieve nothing, and, quote, progress towards no fundamental or meaningful end, being careful to fall just short of pushing them to the point of revolt, crafting illusions and delusions to satiate and calm them, just enough to avoid sparking a reaction. In other words, if I were pressed to design a means and methods of living to most efficiently squander our potential, I would design something almost identical to our present system. Now, whether we walked into this organically or by way of conspiracy or some combination thereof, we're truly at this extreme as we speak. We have this world now. At this stage, it's beyond debate that our politicians, the heads of our intelligence services and law enforcement agencies, our network media and tech companies, are marching to the same drumbeat, and whether willfully or unknowingly, all serving a relatively singular master, with infused money across all sectors acting as the tendrils of this creature, and the Federal Reserve and central banking acting as its seedy core. In the future, when we look back on this era, it'll stand as the clearest testament to the fact that when mankind lacks a, quote, highest value, a core fundamental truth around which to orient himself, his thoughts and his actions and his reason for being, this internal void causes them to become hollow. This hollowness causes them to become superficially ambitious and grasping, which in turn causes them to be easily controlled by any force with a reason to control them. A malleable populace led to and fro to carry out the whims of unseen puppet masters, using simple but powerful systems of carrots and sticks, incentives and punishments. For countless generations, it was our conception of God, the archetype of creation and the highest perfection from whom all things flow, that allowed for this healthier orientation and firm footing. In seeking to walk in these footsteps, to emulate his rightness or carry out his will, we fashioned and shaped ourselves according to our depth of understanding of the divine. We sought to banish our all-too-human energy-dissipating vices, our petty or selfish sentiments, our greed or cowardice. This All-Father was our harbor, our central pillar and foundation. In the late 1800s, a German philosopher uttered those now infamous words, destined to strike existential terror in the hearts of all who understood them. Quote, "God is dead." Presumably, this wasn't stated with triumphant pride or with any celebratory undertone, but as a warning. Increasingly, our conception of God is, for the most part and in most cases, a linguistic and intellectual understanding, meaning we can only make use of our very fallible human brains to create imperfect and imprecise language to attempt to understand and communicate his true nature. And over the generations, as corrupt men in roles of both church and state used their power and influence to steer this understanding in a direction that most benefited them, it was as if a seed of pure truth became wrapped in layer after layer of skewed, tweaked, and compromised truth, again in incremental stages. Doctrines of belief and our very understanding of the nature of God became ever more removed from the source, ever more flawed, a copy of a copy of a copy, with much being lost in each successive iteration. In our age, this subversion has reached a peak. The highest and most noble aims and virtues, served in prior ages, have morphed into a cheap political and utilitarian framework. Meritocratic hierarchies meant to safeguard our avenues of power, degenerating into a pathological obsession with an attempt to artificially impose equality and equity. Our highest conception of pure justice devolving into, quote, social justice. The formerly lofty conception of love and kindness twisted into a tolerance, in some cases enthusiastic embrace, of ideas and behaviors that couldn't be more contrary to God's will, as exemplified by nature and the natural order. As Dostoevsky so brilliantly framed it in The Story of the Grand Inquisitor, if Jesus himself were to return today, he'd likely pose the greatest threat to the modern church and similar power brokers in this world, to the extent that he'd be rejected, banished, or killed. Speaking personally, growing up in this age and being insatiably curious in the deepest sense of that word, it didn't take long to realize things certainly weren't as they should be. What started as a hesitant assumption, hesitant because I feared it might be born of youthful inexperience or misunderstanding, grew into greater confidence and certainty over many years. Slowly but surely, I couldn't help but see signs of a world so sick, so lost, so deceived, and sprinting headlong down a dark path that a fire was lit at the deepest level. Such a powerful fire, in fact, that much of my life since has been spent attempting to keep it under control, to avoid early death, or a lifetime in prison, or some similar disaster, with mixed results. This fire manifested as undirected rage, initially, to the extent that I was a completely uncontrollable and dangerous human being. This was the inevitable result of only seeing what seemed to be insurmountable problems all around me. A world that seemed to be governed by self-interested corruption, deceit, the most brazen manipulation, in which so much that I loved and resonated with was relentlessly caricatured, mocked, and demonized, and the opposite was cheered, championed, aggressively injected into our cultural stream of consciousness, and done so behind a palatable enough mask to give the impression to the casual observer that this wasn't the intrusion of a dark void, but rather the bringing of light. The shift, for me, the point in which I ceased being an enemy to the world and myself, and allowing immense energy to be wasted in directionless anger and rebellion, might be equated to waking up one day to find your father dead, your house on fire, and your siblings in a comatose stupor, and realizing definitively that, at least as far as this material plane is concerned, no responsible force seems to be at the helm anymore, and you can't rely on anyone to save the day or right the ship. There's no quicker maturation process than this. Like a lightning bolt striking to permanently change one's course in life, I knew I didn't want to live in this new world taking such malformed shape. And this presented two options: cease to live and tap out like a coward, or figuratively take up the sword and fight, ideally in the purest and best sense of that word. And although it wasn't a conscious decision, not something I formalized or said to myself or set down in writing, I essentially became a revolutionary, for lack of a better term. This is something of a dirty and muddied word, and justifiably so. In the past several generations, most revolutionaries and revolutions have been net negatives. The Jacobins, the Judeo-Masonic French Revolution that wore such an attractive mask to conceal its base intentions, the Black Hand organization, whose infamous shot helped kickstart the First World War and end the lives of millions of courageous and respectable men, while bestowing inestimable fortunes on their opposites, extending to the present day, and Saul Alinsky and his Rules for Radicals, a handbook for pseudo-revolutionaries, which he, correctly, I feel, dedicated to the archetypal force he channeled to write the work, Lucifer, the original rebel or revolutionary. These were all sick men, ideas, and movements, representing a fight against nature, and thus a fight against God. I believe there are two polar opposite archetypal natures that manifest through human beings. One seeks to give, to help, to enrich and improve those around them. The other seeks to take, to enslave and leech energy, to gain personal advantage, to hoard and have a leg up over those around them, perhaps deceived into believing this is the path to happiness, just as a hopeless drug addict might view his drug of choice as the only path to contentment. Jesus was a brilliant example of the former. The Buddha would certainly be classed in the same category, as would nearly every hero and lofty figure in the Western tradition. None of them devoted their lives to personal profit. All of them devoted themselves to a higher purpose. As our modern age so clearly proves, there's an extreme danger in allowing this latter type to attain power. And when such a type gets their foot in the door, there's a very real threat of a total monopolization of the levers of power, as they tend to only work to advance or promote similar natures, those of their own type. And where they succeed, all outside their small circle inevitably suffer as a result. So when I say revolutionary and speak to the existence of new revolutionaries, please do resist the urge to lump our ideas in with these scoundrels and criminals of previous ages that wear the same label. You see, these men largely succeeded in their aims. They reshaped the world in their image in countless ways, seen and unseen. They've made great strides in their efforts to dethrone God, and, like Talmudic Pharisees, installed themselves on every front as the translators and interpreters of his word and doctrine, crowning pure intellect, fallible human intellect, largely devoid of heart and spirit and the divine, in its place. A self-proclaimed expert class and chosen, intended to rule their human cattle.
The dictatorship of the future, I think, will be very unlike the dictatorships which we've been familiar with in the immediate past. I mean, take another book prophesying the future, which was a very remarkable book, George Orwell's 1984. Well, this book was written at the height of the Stalinist regime and just after the Hitler regime. And there he foresaw a dictatorship using entirely the methods of terror, the methods of physical violence. Now, I think what is going to happen in the future is the dictators will find, as the old saying goes, that you can do everything with bayonets except sit on them. That if you want to preserve your power indefinitely, you have to get the consent of the ruled. And this they will do partly by drugs, as I foresaw in Brave New World, partly by these new techniques of propaganda. They will do it by bypassing the sort of rational side of man and appealing to his subconscious and his deeper emotions and his physiology even, and so making him actually love his slavery. I mean, I think this is the danger, that actually people may be in some ways happy under the new regime, but they will be happy in a situation where they oughtn't to be happy.
But let me ask you this. You're talking about a world that could take place within the confines of a totalitarian state. Let's become more immediate, more urgent about it. We believe, anyway, that we live in a democracy here in the United States. Do you believe that this brave new world that you talk about could, let's say in the next quarter century, the next century, could come here to our shores?
I think it could. I mean, that's why I feel it's so extremely important here and now to start thinking about these problems, not to let ourselves be taken by surprise by the new advances in technology. I mean, for example, in regard to the use of the drugs, we know there's enough evidence now for us to be able, on the basis of this evidence and using a certain amount of creative imagination, to foresee the kind of uses which could be made in by people of bad will with these things, and to attempt to forestall this. And in the same way, I think with these other methods of propaganda, we can foresee and we can do a good deal to forestall. I mean, after all, the price of freedom is eternal vigilance.
To be a revolutionary now, at this point in history, is to seek to obliterate this foul creation, to unseat artificial constructs, the unnatural, to strike at the roots of this anti-nature rebellion against God and his creation and the natural order, and to completely divest such sick hearts and minds from positions of power and influence. Not to seek revenge or to seek to hurt and harm these highest of all criminals, but to do positive, to work to help free the world from their yoke. As much as I've parted with that German philosopher, whose capable mind I'll always be in awe of as long as I live, I owe so much to the philosophical conception he labeled the revaluation of all values, and this idea's shaping effect on my own life. Simply put, this means a complete reevaluation of everything, especially so much we take for granted. Conventions, habits, traditions, standard modes of thinking and doing. This is a dangerous and explosive philosophy and approach to the world, and I'd like to make clear that I see immense value in traditions and conventions, broadly speaking. In the best of times, and in healthy and happy eras, they're essentially our instructional handbook, our means of avoiding the mistakes of those who came before us, benefiting from the endless wealth of lessons learned, making ourselves all the more strong and robust as a result. But in this specific moment in history, in this particular situation we find ourselves in, this ability to pull back and soar above and beyond norms and conventions, to objectively analyze their value and efficacy and where they're taking us, is invaluable and a necessity as a first step. Those of us descended from Western mankind are a product of high-trust cultures and societies. Within these environments, convention and tradition played extremely positive roles, and it's easy to see why. If every single individual was engaged in this revaluation of all values, we'd quickly be lost in confused chaos. No unifying truth or theme, no cohesion or common ground, every man striking off down his own path, seeking his own truth. Trusting the wisdom and life experience of those who came before us was our elegant solution here, our graceful sidestep to avoid this potentiality. But disaster struck, and we've since lost the plot in this regard. Picture a dusty, ancient-looking book in which each and every one of your ancestors, stretching back into the dawn of time, wrote a single line aiming to communicate the most valuable lesson they felt able to convey to posterity after the sum total of their years and life experiences. Now picture setting that book on fire and turning your back on it as it burns. This is how we've treated our inheritance. University professors have studiously taught a pathological hatred for, quote, whiteness, and thus all of Western civilization by proxy. By design, we've been completely divested of our roots, because a rootless people can be controlled and shifted to and fro with effortless ease by those insatiably seeking power for its own sake. Millions throughout America and Europe now have the intuitive sense that something is very wrong, that we took a wrong turn somewhere, coupled with an energetic desire to tear down these increasingly sick systems. And the stage is now set for the most profound fight, stretching across borders, cultures, political systems. This desire to destroy this poisonous control structure is healthy, instinctive, and in accordance with our higher nature. But destroying without being ready and able to create something viable in its place is a dangerous game, and possibly the recipe for another disaster in the future, or a series of them, leading to a prolonged period of devastating instability, even anarchy. So, I'd like to play some small part in kickstarting a discussion regarding what a better world might look like, how it might be structured and function relative to present. Some of what follows may sound crazy, and this is completely understandable. Virtually nobody discusses or even actively thinks about concepts like these, at least from this broadest perspective, which means that these are essentially uncharted waters, untrammeled ground, and the unprecedented and brand new can't help but sound a bit insane at first glance. The creation of a better world seems so distant and out of reach, and until very recently, we'd collectively cultivated a sense of powerlessness, even hopelessness on these fronts. I'm asking that you reject these feelings, and more importantly, that you consider the very act of holding them, collectively, risks their becoming self-fulfilling prophecies. The best way to keep a capable population powerless is simply to convince them of their powerlessness. Do everything under the sun to cause them to believe every path forward lacks viability, that there are no solutions. In reality, this couldn't be further from the truth, and it's a cowardly and degenerate mode of thinking. We should be thankful our ancestors weren't weak enough to embrace a similar mindset. The unspoken truth is that virtually anything is possible, especially at a moment like this. Whether entire nations might adopt similar modes of thinking and governing and living in the near future is an open question. But whether we might be capable, as smaller groups of like-minded individuals willing to make the necessary sacrifices to see it come to fruition, isn't an open question. Of course we're capable. And frankly, if we wanted it badly enough, we could make it happen almost immediately. I certainly don't suggest being so hasty. I'm simply making the point that it's technically possible. My aim is to kickstart a discussion that helps solidify some of the broader principles, and from here, more capable minds than my own might discuss, debate, argue, and refine until we reach some points of energetic agreement, and from there, perhaps begin to take the first steps forward. I'll be attempting to cover an immense amount of ground here. In fact, probably too much. So I'll try to maintain a focus on the more fundamental points and avoid digression into specifics, and save these for future discussions. So, let's begin. Let's start by posing a question. There are countless historical accounts of populations existing hundreds, even thousands of years ago, with relatively high standards of living. Despite what we're told by the past few decades of academics and historians attempting to rewrite history in this regard, life was certainly not, quote, nasty, brutish, and short across the entire scope of pre-industrial revolution history. And it's easy to understand why. Our needs as human beings aren't terribly extensive or complex. Food, shelter, clothing, some social contact or sense of community, some basic structure of laws or governance, some entertainments and hobbies and novel pastimes, and some sense of meaningful purpose. Many of the high points of Western civilization had all of these and more. In the time of Plato and Socrates and Aristotle, they had them to such a degree that they were able to devote a resulting excess of time and energy to intellectual and spiritual pursuits, to exploration, conquest, masterful works of art, an overflowing abundance of health and energy, and every generation since has benefited from the resulting creative genius. So the question is this: why is it then that over 2,000 years later, we're not living in something of a paradise on Earth? After a millennia of the most rapid technological innovation, allowing us the ability to handle all of these basic needs in a fraction of the time and effort, theoretically, we should all be far less busy and stressed and anxious. Extreme poverty and homelessness should be relics of prior ages, and we should be spending our time and energy in a manner of our own choosing, in meaningful ways, completely freed from the shackles of immediate necessity, happier, physically and mentally and spiritually healthier, more confident and content. The fact that our present reality bears no resemblance to this represents a massive failure on our part, and a failure for which there's simply no excuse. The inefficiency regarding how we choose to direct and harness our time and energy is simply incredible. We're now in the absurd position of having discussions about how to create jobs, regardless of their necessity or fundamental worth, merely to preserve order. And we now have vast swaths of occupations created to serve this sprawling economic structure that are several layers removed from the creation of real, tangible value. And these types of problems are only getting worse. And let me further explain what I mean here. A farmer produces obvious and direct tangible value, helping to cultivate food needed to survive. A construction worker creates structures, an architect helps design them. A firefighter or an EMT may not create anything tangible, but still play an obviously vital and directly helpful role in preserving health and human life. But consider the number of individuals employed in, for example, advertising by competing companies like a Pepsi or a Coke, or ridiculously well-compensated prosecutors or defense attorneys arguing head-to-head in court, or a market speculator or derivatives trader. How does the devotion of so much energy and some of the best minds in the world down these paths and others like them fundamentally help the world at large? As a species, we've yet to scratch the surface with regard to the piecing together of our past to better understand our origins, via disciplines like archaeology or genetics. The rainforests, proven to harbor building blocks for disease cures among so many other valuable things, still lie almost completely unstudied and unexplored. The story is the same with the deep ocean and with space above us. Meanwhile, our air is becoming more polluted with far beyond just carbon, our water brimming with prescription drugs and a cocktail of similar chemicals, atop which we now dump fluoride. Our food now contains more poorly understood chemicals and preservatives, many of which are now proven beyond any shadow of a doubt to cause long-term harms, than at any point in history. Imagine focusing on creating jobs entirely devoted to reversing these trends. These unanswered questions and pressing problems represent just a few examples of foundationally important occupational pursuits we might develop. Imagine if this massive and ever-growing wealth of intellect and talent might be shifted from dealing with the minutiae in areas like advertising or finance or accounting, and into occupations that directly benefit a people. One might counter, but most of these occupations are necessary to create this world of plenty, of wealth and excess. The question here becomes, do we need this type of wealth and excess? Does it fundamentally improve us as human beings? Do we need 1,000 different varieties of toothpaste, each with a design team to create its unique packaging, another to manage stocking and shipping and related computer databases to track both, an advertising team to hype it to the public, separate research teams to reinvent the wheel and likely duplicate research being done by their competitors? Might a community be able to live happily with a mere 100 varieties of toothpaste? Perhaps even 10? The same question exists for thousands of other products and services. Right this moment, think of how many man-hours and how many brilliant minds are devoted to finding means and methods of tricking your brain into wanting something that you don't need. If you're able, try to picture something radically different. And to make it easier, let's picture a breakaway society starting from scratch, and thus able to formulate its own currency, its own government and leadership, economic structure, and generally chart its own course. And for the sake of argument, let's presume this breakaway society has adopted the traditional definition of a nation, which was the only definition throughout history up until very recently, and is thus made up of citizenry with strong unifying bonds, whether these be cultural or racial or ideological or spiritual, with family at the center and one's fellow citizens being viewed as something of an extended family. This type of philia, of mutual love and respect, is a necessary prerequisite for a healthy nation, and for much of what we're about to discuss. Now picture this nation or community willingly choosing to adopt something like a meritocratically planned economy at the outset, to allow for the public to determine which professions are most needed and which represent the most obvious net positive use of time and energy. And perhaps even a voting system allowing them to decide on a range of income for each. making the conscious decision to focus on fundamentals. Everything from the basics, things like food and shelter and clothing production, and when these bases are covered, devoting excess energies to push down paths deemed most important by the population as a whole. As with so much I'll be mentioning here, there are quite a few specific ways this might be carried out, and to keep this from becoming a 5-hour video, I won't be speaking to them in most cases. But lest anyone think that it isn't possible, there's nothing insurmountably difficult about creating a database of all existing occupational paths, and allowing for the submission of new ones, which every member of the public might have access to, and submit a vote as to whether the job deserves a higher or lower income relative to the present displayed range. And this ability to post ideas, to essentially seek patronage from the public at large, is key. Picture any individual or group or team of individuals being able to submit their own ideas for jobs and occupations at any time. Anything from street cleaner to planting trees or landscaping work to the development of a new engine or vehicle. They'd first outline the why it might be helpful, the how it might be accomplished, a general time frame, and the end result goal they hope to achieve when all is said and done. The public, using their judgment as a currency, could then choose to back those projects they felt had the most net positive potential. Those projects that were successful, achieved their stated goals, or accomplished something meaningful, would see their, quote, stock rise accordingly, as the public collectively voiced their opinion that this had been a positive use of time and energy. And those with keen judgment, those first backers of the project, would experience gains accordingly, and their judgment would then be valued more heavily in the future. A structure like this, properly executed, would open the door to unlimited creativity and a naturally created meritocratic hierarchy of voting power according to proven judgment, and would encourage the average member of the public to take their judgments and resulting votes seriously, and carefully consider the types of efforts, ideas, or individuals they chose to get behind. Such a structure might help kickstart a self-propelled and adaptable and self-governing economy, and help completely eliminate the concept of unemployment. Picture especially creative individuals or teams drawing up proposals to help facilitate things like matchmaking, with the goal of fostering meaningful and successful relationships to help solve the very real problems posed by, for example, the growing number of, quote, incels, and the broader ramifications of our extremely sick dating culture and courtship process, now so dominated by one-dimensional apps like Tinder. Picture other teams setting out to create adult sports leagues, hiking or shooting or workout clubs, or clubs centered around any given hobby or interest. Others devoted to working to meaningfully help alcoholics or opiate addicts, or those with debilitating mental health issues. And I do mean help. To achieve their desired result, such organizations have to be developed by and for a strong community, with a strong sense of cohesion, brotherhood, and shared purpose. Not some philanthropic byproduct created to help assuage the conscience of a billionaire, operated like some soulless bureaucratic institution. Essentially, what I'm getting at here is a complete reevaluation of priorities, a conscious choosing of where we'd like to devote and direct our collective energies, as opposed to this current structure we've inelegantly stumbled into over time, a sprawling and unnecessarily complex system which now seems so geared towards ministering to our every addiction, and so often catering to our basest instincts in the process, with the inevitable side effect of causing some of our worst individuals to earn great wealth, and thus garner great power and influence. The core of this idea is a reorienting of our energy towards the benefit of one another, as opposed to benefiting a soulless economic machine. And this leads to another big idea, so big that I won't blame anyone for not being able to fully envision it, due to its near total contrast with our present reality. I'd like to see not just a total ban on advertising, but a complete shift to an evidence-based environment across the board. Consider for a moment what the word advertising really means. In common practice, it refers to the manipulative hyping of a product or service. And through the use of this dark magic, we've created an environment in which something vastly inferior might be a financial success if a company is able to lie most effectively, or dupe their audience most efficiently. I'd love to see this potentiality entirely eliminated. This playing field that grants such immense power to hucksters, manipulators, and deceivers, at the cost of those who refuse to stoop to play these games. Picture an environment where all new products and services were exhaustively tested and put through the paces by a sufficient number of completely objective individuals with no vested interests. Hypothetically, this data could then be handled and processed by a third-party organization, again with zero incentive to be dishonest in either direction, specifically designed to ensure there's no room for corruption or payoffs behind the scenes, resulting in a completely objective storehouse of data and a wealth of even-handed, unbiased ratings and reviews to help guide and inform future potential customers. Again, the moment we attempt to speak to the overly specific nature of how an idea like this might manifest, it risks sounding a bit hokey or strange or less viable, as we're so prone to finding countless reasons as to why this or that conceptual path might lead to failure. But nobody can deny that the essence of this idea, namely the complete elimination of advertising in favor of unbiased, evidence-based judgments, is possible. The avenue a society might take to get there is up for debate, but the fundamental idea, if manifested into reality, would be an immense net positive, allowing everything in the marketplace to succeed or fail based on merits alone, on a truly level playing field. Consider what advertisements are and what they do to us. Every day, all day, we endure a never-ending barrage of hype and dishonesty, intended to inflame desires and lusts for things that won't bring us genuine happiness or contentment. There couldn't be a more unhealthy mode of being. There's a reason Dante, in the Inferno, chose to depict those souls hopelessly gripped by lust and desire as blowing needlessly and pointlessly back and forth. An exclusively materialistic focus represents wasted time, wasted life, chasing phantoms and illusion. We've become endlessly distracted beings, chasing false solutions to very real problems, and this 24/7 hype machine is a prime reason. I'd like to see it completely destroyed. How would an individual then find products and services, you might ask? And how might an economy exist at all in such a world? Again, I think there are several possibilities here, and I hate to cheapen the broader idea by pointing to any one of these overly specific paths. But assuming this hypothetical breakaway society chose to continue to embrace certain aspects of technology deemed most net positive and least dangerous, a database or website might easily exist, acting as a catalog and white pages of sorts that could then be queried freely by any seeking a specific product. Or the decision might be made to choose to return to the literal white pages and the printed word as a catalog. The broader goal wouldn't be the elimination of material possessions, but rather the elimination of our lives completely revolving around them, of our being incessantly bombarded with manipulative and dishonest messaging designed by experts for the expressed purpose of causing us to make a decision we'd otherwise not make. And I think nearly all would agree that our fundamental purpose as human beings isn't to consume or be consumers. Yet this is what we're being made into by an insatiable subset of mankind in a never-ending push for greater personal power and control. Breaking this spell requires divesting this culture of this manipulative weapon. And this all-important theme of operating as a, quote, evidence-based society in all respects, as opposed to allowing manipulation and hype to win the day, might extend far beyond the economic sphere. At present, our levers of power and influence are dominated by a small subset of self-proclaimed experts across a number of fields. Anthony Fauci would be a good example here, as would any one of the leaders of the think tank organizations in America, responsible for literally writing and dictating most of our foreign policy, or the type of pundits and experts regularly appearing on network media interviews. This culture has been masterfully effective at creating endless credential or award bestowing organizations to pat each other on the back and hand one another signs and symbols to communicate to the public that they're worthy of trust and respect. The problem, of course, is that this class of intellectuals and experts has a history of being very, very wrong, very, very often. They've caused devastating economic or geopolitical panics, led us into costly wars, spearheaded health scares bordering on hysteria, and few things better exemplify the flaws in our modern manner of doing things than the fact that these people are not only not held accountable, but they so often maintain, even strengthen, their positions of power and influence despite their track record. This is madness. Now, there's many routes by which a people might implement a purely evidence-based structure to prevent this type of thing, but I'll give just one to better explain the broader idea. Picture every major decision made by those in positions of power and influence was logged, noted down as of the moment it was made, and a ledger was kept. Let's use the Iraq War, for example. Let's presume this ledger existed online, accessible to all. An official document might be submitted at the outset, outlining precisely what they seek to accomplish and why, and the expected outcome of the action. Now picture the public being able to log a vote at any point in the future as to whether they felt the intended goal had been achieved, whether, broadly speaking, it had ended up being a net positive or net negative decision, all things considered. And imagine a running tally being kept of the overall track record of each public figure. If you're with me so far, let's take one more step. Imagine a judgment track record of every individual citizen that chose to vote, to weigh in on issues like these, of political importance. Now, picture each individual having their voting power being weighted according to this judgment track record. In other words, both citizens or public officials that make decisions later deemed by the public to be correct decisions will slowly but surely gain voting power accordingly. And those with a long track record of abysmal decisions see their voting power diminished accordingly. Meaning, if 80% of the meritocratic weighted vote declares the Iraq War to have been a mistake, to have fallen short of the goals or predicted outcome initially laid out, those citizens that voted against the decision would see their voting power slightly boosted. Those who voted for slightly decreased. Long story short, this means a man like Fauci wouldn't maintain a position of immense influence merely through the power of the praise of his friends and allies. He'd need to actually be correct from time to time in his judgments and predictions. It also means those who mindlessly adore such media-created personalities would see their voting power significantly lessened over time, if these individuals continued to make decisions that turned out to be significant judgment errors. This would allow our judgment to act as something of a currency, not just for those in powerful and influential positions, but for every citizen with an opinion to voice. A bit like a judgment-driven stock market, in which good decisions caused your overall balance to slowly increase over time. And here's yet another big idea to consider. Instead of our news media outlets being offered to the highest bidder, and thus our airwaves completely dominated by the messages and ideas they seek to sell us, picture a more tightly controlled environment, in which meritocratic voting determined what types of content is most prominently displayed to the average information consumer, across both television and the internet. This would allow the population at large to work together to make the difficult decisions of what type of content might best foster health and happiness and improvement, and which types are degenerate poisons to be relegated to the sidelines. It would allow the public, ideally in a meritocratic manner, to retake control of their airwaves and most prominent influence arenas. There are three core ideas underlying nearly every suggestion voiced in this video. Three conceptions and goals that might be kept foremost in mind in hypothetically destroying this old world and creating something robust and lasting in its place. Firstly, the elimination of parasitism. All means and methods an individual might exploit to gain great wealth and luxury and decadence from the labor and competence of others. Secondly, the elimination of unnecessary complexity and the embrace of clarity and simplicity, and a reorientation towards the most fundamental elements that allow us to cultivate a healthy mind, body, and soul. And thirdly, the championing of freedom in its truest sense. And it's vital I explain what I mean here, because I think many of us have been sold on an overly narrow and unnatural conception of this word. This idea that once acted as the core and backbone of those cultures representing the tallest peaks in the Western tradition. When I say freedom, I'm not referring to some superficial notion of, quote, rights. In its highest form, this word freedom means avoiding being artificially or manipulatively compelled down unhealthy paths, not representative of our true nature. Living within an environment that devotes so much of its energy to indoctrination and psychological conditioning, as we do now, makes this purest and highest form of freedom nearly impossible to attain. We are politically and philosophically and spiritually misled, while simultaneously distracted by the overwhelming sensory overload of advertisement and hype in all of its forms, not just for products and services, but celebrity idols, corrupt leadership, and Trojan horse ideas and conceptions. How ridiculous does the purely and superficially politically libertarian conception of freedom seem when this truth is recognized? Having the, quote, right to watch a certain type of pornography or enjoy a certain type of drug doesn't make a person free, when nearly their every informational input is designed to control and constrain their manner of thinking and feeling and being, or designed to inflame and stoke their most petty materialistic desires. I'd go a step further and add that I'd like to see individuals start to consider the conscious and willful giving up of these types of freedoms in a breakaway community of the type we're discussing. Perhaps electing a council of individuals to a judgment role, tasked with determining whether various vices or net negative behaviors might be stamped out. In other words, a population proactively deciding to restrict itself and exercise discipline and self-control at the community or state or collective level. At present, we have the illusion of freedom, while being guided and compelled down specific narrow paths. This illusion of freedom is far more dangerous than even a complete absence of freedom. But this leads to another important point I think needs to be made on the subject. I think it's a mistake to presume that laws and legislation is the mechanism by which we might best change behaviors and fundamentally improve things. I strongly believe these changes need to happen naturally, organically, and culturally, as a result of individuals being convinced of healthier ways to live or think, as opposed to legal compulsion. For example, if a hypothetical breakaway community were populated with those of like mind on these issues, and if our information stream wasn't subverted or corrupted, and such a community had its own newspapers or periodicals or books and websites and so forth, there should, and likely would, be no need for such laws. We tend to act according to prevailing norms, and according to the culture around us, and its incentives and disincentives. If a person knew that engaging in completely degenerate or destructive behavior would cause him to be less respected, or outright shunned by all around him, he's much more likely to avoid stumbling down that path than if some mere law or prohibition existed. I sometimes think we underestimate just how powerful it might be to control our own information flow, to be freed from this 24/7 influx of network media and social media, which are quite literally being used as tools to efficiently reshape our minds. Nearly everything else is downstream from this, and so much net positive would happen naturally as a result. The poison entering the bloodstream of the cultural or racial or national body would simply cease to be, and a storehouse of long pent-up tradition and custom and inherited wisdom crafted over millennia to help foster health and happiness and creativity, might then take its place. Picture the power of this hypothetical nation-state having its own search engine, governed by algorithms created according to the collective input of like minds, regularly giving feedback on whether they considered any given information source useful and accurate and honest, or the opposite, and structuring all search results accordingly. And this regaining control of our own information stream wouldn't just extend to all manifestations of news and social media, but schooling and education as well. We've mentioned the idea of gutting a vast swath of occupations that don't have some direct and obvious positive impact, or a restructuring to hugely reduce the incentives to enter such professions. In this hypothetical, what might be done with the individuals who perform such roles to earn their livelihood? Well, if you'll bear with me, picture this as an idea. Picture the creation of new institutions, ideally cropping up everywhere and in large numbers across this hypothetical nation, acting a bit like apprenticeship schools, in which teachers are selected entirely on the basis of merit within their specific fields, to teach classes in a master and apprentice dynamic. If you're able, picture such institutions being so widespread that any person that sought to learn any fundamental skill set might find an opening somewhere, especially if they were willing to relocate to do so, much like students do when they attend college. Instead of acting as credential mills and houses of indoctrination, handing out degrees to signify an individual's willingness to jump through hoops as a dutiful servant of the status quo, these institutions instead might act as a much more hardline, no-nonsense organ of education. Not only would teachers be appointed due to proven competence, but retained according to their teaching proficiency. To again risk getting specific to further illustrate and communicate what I mean here, picture an apprenticeship institution devoting to teaching the art of sculpture. Tests might be devised by a handful of masters in the field, and regularly updated or rotated in and out to prevent a student from being able to know the questions beforehand, or a teacher being able to teach to the test. And such tests might involve written questions and answers, as well as requiring the student, in this case, to produce a finished product. Such tests may take place at the beginning and then again the end of each year, to allow for some definitive measure of how much they've learned and improved. And each teacher might then be credited with the overall gains measured across all of his students, so that a teacher's teaching ability might be compared to one another. Having these quantifiable, definitive, objective measures would allow for experimentation to find ideal class size, teaching methods, and generally help ensure the teaching process is efficient and effective. This is just one example. Again, there are several methods that might be employed here. But the goal would be not only an objective measure of the teacher's ability to teach his given subject, but also an objective measure of the competence of each student. Picture a high bar for each graduation, with only a small percentage of students graduating each year. And perhaps an equally high bar for teachers, retaining only a small percentage from year to year, and heavily incentivizing competition for the roles. Ideally, this might become one of the most highly valued occupations. If something like this might be coupled with a culture of encouragement as opposed to shaming those that failed to reach these high marks, and allowed students to continue learning for as long as they wished, or freely transfer to another discipline if they learned sculpture wasn't their strong suit, until they discovered their own ideal path, I could see such an idea yielding real dividends. And this might sound incredible at first blush, but I'd even like to see individuals earn a living wage in exchange for putting forth proper efforts in this student and apprentice role. This basic wage might decrease each year, incentivizing them to find their preferred lane as quickly as they're able, or enter into a separate range of occupations for which skills testing isn't required. But I strongly believe finding some means of paying livable wages to both sides of this master and apprentice equation is far from impossible, if a culture collectively decided it was worthwhile to do so and to make it a priority. Picture an entire nation devoted to learning and cultivating mastery within disciplines that fundamentally matter when it comes to improving health and happiness and generally beautifying our world. Over time, such a structure would lead to a massive wealth transfer from middlemen, usurious bankers, vice peddlers, those who most effectively play upon our weaknesses and base materialistic desires, and into the hands of builders, creators, artists, and those that perform the most necessary tasks to keep our world running smoothly. And it would double as a means of creating new respect and influence hierarchies, meaning masters of a given field will be called masters due to their proven objective merit, not according to some mere consensus of their peers, a path that opens the door to endless corruption, manipulation, and deceit. I realize ideas like this are difficult to envision. We've long lived within the architecture of a consumer-driven economy, obsessed with the idea of consumption, and pretending the propagation of this idea might somehow lead to happiness. If we're able to accept that this was a flawed premise, that we made a mistake in embracing this assumption, I'm hopeful we might then be able to envision new frameworks to operate in its place. And the clock is ticking. The looming and unspoken threat of the globalist ethos, the destruction of borders and nations, and the presumption that the entire world might best function as a shopping mall for the purpose of buying and selling, is that its inevitable result is the destruction of all diversity. Diversity of races, of cultures, of manners of thinking and being and seeing the world. Instead of celebrating our differences and allowing our innate differences to naturally manifest and flourish, a globalist future might be equated to locking us all in the same room, with the same tune playing in the background, pretending it might be able to reprogram such different people, to force them to pull in the same direction towards the exact same goals. Goals which somehow always seem to benefit a small ruling class, and at the cost of all those who haven't joined this small club. I don't think it's a coincidence that nearly every artistic or literary depiction of a technology-dominated future represents it as a drab, depressing, bleak, and dystopian environment. It's as if this intuition, existing in the recesses of our subconscious, was intended as a warning to ourselves, from ourselves, across time and space. There is no life down this path. These frameworks for the management of human intellect and energies aren't suited to fundamentally improve our lives. They're being designed by men who think in terms of economic utility. They spring from a merchant class mentality. And this psychological orientation knows only one goal, first and foremost, one ruling drive: profit. An economic or political system should serve people. People shouldn't be reprogrammed to serve a system. When the latter begins to happen, we risk becoming mere utilitarian cogs in a lifeless and spiritless machine, and risk losing the ability to manifest and cultivate our higher nature, our spark of divinity. We lose touch with God. Just as those who worship spirit begin to disprize and devalue matter and the material, those who worship the material begin to devalue and lose touch with spirit. And life inevitably becomes more petty, base, mean, as people become small, greedy, and self-serving. I've always felt this would be a fate worse than death. Why live as an automaton, carrying out scripted thought, word, and deed, housed in increasingly small cubicles, working at unfulfilling jobs we care nothing about, digesting increasingly superficial entertainment, hitching our time and energy to a wagon directed by unseen hands towards unknown ends, unwittingly playing the role of dumb oxen. It's pure madness, when so much more is possible and within our grasp. Whether or not we've found the words to express this, I think most of us intuitively feel it. And so, despite having so much more to say on these fronts, this leads me to the final point in this video. I believe we have a role to play, marked out by fate and destiny. Specifically, those listening to this video and those like them, the type awake and aware enough to sense that something is deeply wrong. that care enough to try to find some means to address this defining crisis of our age. I used the analogy earlier of waking up to find our father dead, our siblings comatose, oblivious and unthinking, and our house on fire. I suspect many of you know exactly what I mean here, and feel something similar. And I know many of us feel immense anger, justified, righteous anger, to the extent that we might just be prone to walk out of that burning house to create something anew, and be happy to leave those siblings to their inevitable fate. Those types that naively embrace statism and Big Brother, whose minds are essentially programmed from the ground up by a bought and paid for press, Netflix, Marvel movies, and social media. The type that approach things like COVID alarmism as a badge of pride, a symbol of their being, quote, educated, and the type that equates reading articles in The Atlantic or The Economist with being informed. I certainly understand the anger felt towards them, but I'd ask you to consider the possibility that most of the population at any given point in history isn't intended to be, and in fact isn't innately designed to be, independent thinkers. The, quote, NPC can play a very real, even valuable role, and in better circumstances, their role is a positive one. They need only a foundation of accurate and healthy information as a starting point. As scripted humanity taught to carry out their programming, they need only healthier data input, and our subverted system has stripped them of this, creating something of a mindless, lumbering, incredibly destructive golem. Many in these ranks are there as a result of simply being too trusting, and this is often a byproduct of being trustworthy. In short, there are still many, many good people conditioned to give voice to ideas and concepts without any in-depth understanding of the implications of their actions. I say this to make the point that I don't think our role is to simply somehow create a healthier environment and then spitefully watch the rest of the world burn around us. I sincerely believe our role is not only to get our own house in order, but to do this in part as a jumping-off point to help others do the same in their own way. To free them from a prison they don't yet realize they're in, and may not realize until it's too late. And to redirect their energies from the service to this Molochian, usurious machine, and to a service to their higher nature. To create art, beauty, balance and stability and harmony, and live in a manner that meaningfully improves our collective lot. And ideally, even begins to help shift such personalities from this mindset of willing domestication and to a true freedom of the most fundamental sort. Picture the cultivation of a culture oriented around service to the highest, to the divine, that consciously chose to make an art of living well in order to help manifest this higher nature into physical reality insofar as we're able. And not living well in the cheapened and bastardized sense sold to us in advertisements, but the most fundamental sense. An embrace of behaviors and mindsets and labors and artistic pursuits that make us stronger and more robust, healthier and happier, and more grateful and optimistic, and a rejection of all those that acted as weights, anchors, encroaching darkness, and a willful rejection of poison pills with deceptive sugary coating. Addicts, whether it be heroin or unhealthy foods or pornography or the most mindless entertainment, are often capable of crafting the most impressive self-justifications for their behavior. And I think we've done this collectively as nations and cultures. And as negative behaviors create dis-ease, we receive a prescription from our expert class, which poses as a cure for one symptom, but simultaneously creates two more negative symptoms as side effects in their place. Thus we seek out another prescription, and this cycle repeats endlessly. The past several decades have marked a rush towards newness, novelty, complexity, as if such developments were always net positives. It's not enough to merely craft something new. There needs to be some redeeming value to this newness. Prizing quantity over quality leads to a world filled with the meaningless and cheap and ugly, filled with noise and distraction. We all have limited time and energy to expend. Devoting it to things that not only don't fundamentally improve us, but so obviously do the opposite, seems a crime against nature, perhaps even the highest of all crimes. Picture a world in which people cared more about the expenditure of their priceless time and attention than the expenditure of these fiat currencies printed and distributed from on high, where the value of things was determined by how well they served the purpose of fundamentally improving or strengthening or enriching us, as opposed to their mere utilitarian profit potential. We're under the misapprehension that we banished the caste structure, when in reality we simply inverted it. And a nation that makes money and markets its exclusive focus will inevitably become shadow-governed by those that control these worlds. And to say these aren't our best men would be a massive understatement. In seeking to envision or create a better world, it's the first step that's the trickiest bit, namely the cultivating sufficient judgment to be able to best define better and worse in order to make definitive value judgments. We need to seek to consciously master the art of healthy discernment, a zoomed-out discernment, a type that, for example, comprehensively examines every new technology or cultural shift or development according to the totality of its effects, not its profit potential or its one-dimensional utility in the immediate term. And this doesn't require an abandonment of technology, but rather a retracing of our most obvious missteps in this regard, coupled with a slower and more considered path of technological innovation, guided by a wise and prudent hand, and one motivated solely by the desire to fundamentally, not superficially, improve life. And yes, such a breakaway community would likely become the foremost target of those so enthusiastically destroying our world, especially as it found its legs and its citizens began to rediscover greater health or happiness. It would receive nothing but the most dishonest and mischaracterized coverage across all media. There would no doubt be attempts by any and every means available to forcibly integrate, to change and reshape its culture and way of life. There would likely be attempts at covert infiltration, sabotage, possibly even false flag events orchestrated to tarnish the image. All of this and more would be essentially guaranteed. So be it. We're up against some of the most aggressively deceitful criminals in human history, but we all know the score, so it's pointless to fret about. Just as the economic and political and social structures should be designed from the ground up to be parasitism and corruption-proof, all decisions across the board should be made with these threats foremost in mind and fully considered, with the goal of stoking an ongoing vigilance and creating a robust defense against any and every possible subversive scheme that might come its way. It'd be the type of fight we should welcome and the type we should feel fully justified in waging. Regardless of what the future may hold, please do recognize that whether we like it or not, the war is already at our doorstep. Much of it is still being waged out of public view, but the battle lines are finally being officially drawn, the factions becoming clear. Throughout America and Europe, this mystery virus with a 99+% survival rate is being used to facilitate the largest wealth and power transfer in modern history, to completely destroy the middle class and small businesses, and leave behind a class of tech and corporate oligarchs more than happy to follow their script in exchange for career advancement, glowing press, and immense financial gain. It's nearly impossible to recognize the historically defining moments while we're actively living them out, and much easier to look back and recognize them in retrospect. This is undoubtedly one of those moments. These are the times that most thoroughly test a man and reveal his character and caliber. I'm asking you to consider taking up a revolutionary mindset, a steadfast refusal to be forced into a future of concrete jungles, living off of soy and bugs, working in some cage or cubicle for some sprawling corporate entity you couldn't care less about. entertaining and distracting ourselves to death while our world implodes around us. And most importantly, a simple refusal as a man to play the role of a domesticated animal or unthinking slave, not just with little to no control over the direction of our own lives, but over the shaping of our own children and all future generations. At every turn, around every corner, there will be some new attractive, intriguing distraction, becoming ever more attractive and intriguing with each passing year, as vice peddlers further refine their methods with algorithmic and scientific precision. A great many of us, exhausted and hopeless, will seek escape via drugs or alcohol, others through video games and entertainments, others through devotion to physical lusts or the hollow rewards of material wealth, and others through the barrel of a gun or a fentanyl overdose. Our hope in the face of all this is to rediscover a new, old breed of mankind, capable of tapping into some inner reserve of strength, of walking past all of these phantoms with stoic discipline, with a recognition that such distractions aren't merely being weaponized for the purposes of our destruction, but that they are beneath us. A recognition that we're meant to be more than merely sensory response mechanisms, endlessly seeking instant gratification. Find your higher nature, embrace it, steel yourself, and put on the armor of God, and seek out your own ideal role. We certainly didn't ask for it, but the battle is now here. And so, let's learn to fight it.